the biggest landlord in Parliament is a Labour MP. The internal politics of the Labour Party, it doesn't do you any favours to be seen as a landlord looking after themselves. The previous government's attempt to pass this bill, I have to say, descended into farce. I would argue that those landlords in Parliament have a particular duty to their tenants, as well as their constituents who voted them in on manifestos to reform private renting.
Tom, welcome to Politics Joe. How are you?
Good, thanks very much.
How would you like to introduce yourself and the Renters Reform Coalition?
So I'm Tom. I'm the director of the Renters Reform Coalition, which is a group of 21 leading housing organisations. We've been pushing for reform of the private rented sector for nearly 5 years now, with mixed success. But I think yesterday we had the government introduce its Renters' Rights Bill, which is something we've been pushing for many years and has the potential to make some real change for renters in this country.
As you said, we're here to talk about the Renters' Right Bill, but you mentioned that Renters Reform Coalition is made up of lots of groups like Shelter and Crisis and different renters unions. And I wondered if you could talk a bit about what you're hearing from them, what the state of the rental market is like, and why legislation is necessary.
I think, yes, you're right. We have many different groups in our coalition, from big housing charities like Shelter and Crisis and Citizens Advice to renters unions to smaller organisations like Generation Rent. I think one of the reasons that the government have come under so much pressure in recent years is thanks to not just our excellent campaigning over the years, but also the fact that the situation has gotten so bad, and that whereas I think once renters could easily be dismissed as only young people, a sort of transient experience that only people who are at uni or have just left uni go through. Actually, the private rented sector has doubled in size since the start of this century. There's many, many more people living in the private rented sector, including families, older people. So I think as a sort of political force, frankly, there are more renters, and that means more votes, and that means more incentive for politicians to address the issue. Now, when it comes to the state of the private rented sector at the moment, it is very, very bad. I think rents have been rising at record levels in recent years, and they're still, despite inflation having come down, they're still rising much faster than wages and inflation. And that means basically, if you're a renter, you're getting worse off vis-a-vis people living in other housing tenures over time. And so that's just really unfair, essentially. You've got wider issues around homelessness. I'm sure your listeners will be aware that the homelessness crisis, particularly in London, but all around the country, is reaching a sort of has reached horrifying new heights recently. There's 150,000 children living in temporary accommodation, and there's been lots of research done that shows that has a terrible effect on their life chances. In addition to that, there's also a crisis of disrepair in privately rented homes, and one in 5 homes in the private rented sector don't meet the government's definition of a decent home standard, and 12% have a Category 1 hazard, which is defined as a serious threat to the health of the tenant. So not great, basically.
You mentioned that this Renters' Rights Bill is a kind of revamp of a Conservative bill that was introduced 5 years ago, which they failed to pass before the general election. What differs in Labour's legislation that they're proposing to what was in the Renters' Reform Bill?
Sure, yeah. Well, I can just give you a brief potted history of the reform agenda. The previous government's attempt to pass this bill, I have to say, descended into farce slightly. They first promised to abolish no-fault evictions in 2019. It went into their 2019 manifesto. They didn't publish a white paper, so the sort of document that you have to consult on proposals before you bring forward legislation. They didn't publish that until 2022. 2023, we had some legislation published. It had been watered down already from the white paper proposals, and immediately out of the gate, we saw the right wing of the Conservative Party gunning for it, basically trying to do everything they could to delay and amend it to water it down, working in cahoots with various landlord organisations who are also seeking to slow the bill down and put amendments in that would reduce its impact and benefits for renters. This bill, which we broadly welcomed yesterday, goes further in a number of areas. One of those is around providing rent. So essentially it abolishes Section 21 no-fault evictions, which are at the heart of what's wrong with the private rented sector. The fact that a landlord can kick you out of your home at a moment's notice hangs over renters. It struggles. It means that they fear standing up for themselves, asking for repairs, asking for a rent increase, and creates this kind of constant insecurity. In response, to abolishing that, it introduces a set of new grounds for eviction that a landlord will have to apply to, and they'll have to prove in court that they have a reason for wanting to take the property back. But there will be longer notice periods for renters where that does take place, and there will be a longer period in which they're guaranteed a minimum term. So previously the minimum fixed term was 6 months, and renters won't be able to be evicted under the new bill for at least a year. We were calling for 2 years as a sort of minimum, but I think 1 year is a step in the right direction. Beyond that, there's some other good measures, like it will introduce a national register of landlords, which is something we've been calling for many years. And I think it has the potential to be a really useful, impactful tool for tenants who are thinking about renting somewhere or rent somewhere currently. Very often there's very little information about sometimes even who your landlord actually is. And I think this database that the government is setting up has the potential to be a very useful tool for tenants and for local authorities pursuing action against bad landlords. In addition to that, they're going to extend something called Awab's Law to the private rented sector. Awab Ishaq was a young boy who died and the coroner in Manchester, and the coroner ruled as a result of it was in part as a result of the serious damp and mould in his socially rented home. That in response, legislation was put in place for the social rented sector, where social landlords would have to respond to complaints of serious damp and mould within a certain time frame. That's being extended to the private rented sector, which is great. And we support that. In addition to that, there will be a ban on bidding wars. And I'm sure any of your listeners who've rented somewhere, not just in London, but around the country, will know that this is one of the almost become a part of life for trying to find somewhere to rent, whereby estate agents, letting agents and landlords will set up mass viewings, trying to sort of pit renters against each other, and then set up a bidding war whereby you will fight and know you'll have to go to the very end of your budget if you want to secure that place to live. And often the actual rent being paid ends up being much, much higher than what it was advertised. So you kind of end up thinking sometimes, well, I just completely wasted my time applying for that.
I remember when I was looking to rent flats, something that a lot of the letting agents or landlords were doing was asking for my salary and my flatmate's salary. And I guess that was to see how much they thought we could overspend on the asking price of rent. I guess, do you think in practice this will mean that flats have to be leased at the price they're advertised at? And do you think that will have, not being able to bid could lead to just rents increasing? Well,
I think that the government have said that they're banning not just the landlords and letting agents from soliciting bids, but also from accepting bids, i.e. they will have to accept the price that they list their property at. Now, I think in a lot of cases, you will probably see a change in behaviour where they'll start to put it on a higher rent and then come down to who can afford it. But I do think there are landlords out there who come up with a price a rent that they want, and they're happy to accept that rent. It sounds like a crazy thing, I'm sure, to some of your listeners, but I think encouraging that kind of behaviour where we can is probably a good thing to do. And I think in a lot of cases, it's actually the letting agents who are on commission who are driving some of this slightly dodgy practice. So clamping down on that will be absolutely key to the success of these changes.
You mentioned Awab's law there, and the bill also includes the Decent Home Standard. Do you think that local authorities have enough power to enforce crackdowns on landlords who are not abiding by this legislation when it's introduced?
That's a really great question, and actually, I mean, the answer to that is probably no, in the sense that most local authorities, they do have powers, but very often lacking resource both in terms of funding and in terms of capacity and skills. Sometimes local authorities will have one trained environmental health officer related to housing, and they're covering a massive private rented sector of hundreds, maybe thousands of properties. And I think one of the key things will be for the government to rebuild the capacity of local authorities who are sort of on their knees when it comes to their finances. We think that there should be funding allocated proportional to the amount of private rented sector properties in that local authority area. Doesn't seem like that crazy an ask, but we're aware that across a number of different areas, campaigners are calling for local authorities to have more funding. And so we've been looking at, okay, we're in this resource-constrained environment. What are the tools that we can use to help local authorities better enforce these regulations around decent home standard, etc.? And one of the things that we've been pushing for and are very encouraged that the government have taken us up on is this idea of rent repayment orders, whereby a tenant themselves can pursue a claim against the landlord, and if successful, they can have some of their rent paid back. So whereas often the problem is that you don't have tenants who maybe don't know their rights or aren't incentivized, because if they're not getting anything for it, what's the incentive for them? Particularly if they've, say, already moved on to a new property and are moving on with their lives and are not thinking the whole time about their rights as renters, which is extremely normal. But if you can have that carrot in terms of, if you find out that your landlord, say, does not meet energy efficiency regulations or has lied on their application for an eviction notice, having a tenant know that they could potentially get an award for, say, their last year's rent. I'm a renter, that having getting back a year's rent would make a massive difference to my life, and I'm sure many other renters are the same. So that's just one of the areas that we've been pushing, and we're actually encouraged that the government are listening on that front. But I think we'll be continuing to press them on that as the bill goes through Parliament.
You mentioned earlier that one of the reasons the Conservatives didn't pass their reform bill was because of because of lobbying from landlords, and because perhaps some of them were landlords. And we know that many Labour MPs are landlords, including Westminster's biggest landlord. Do you think that there's a conflict of interest when MPs are landlords? And do you think that it in any way will impact how effectively the Labour government can deliver on renters' reforms?
It's a good question. I mean, we've been clear that we don't think that being a landlord should prohibit you from being an MP. Now, there have been various calls over the years that people should recuse themselves. But being a member of parliament, you should be able to put your personal interests aside when you're coming to a determination. Actually, I would argue that those landlords in parliament have a particular duty to their tenants, as well as their constituents who voted them in on manifestos to reform private renting, to get on and deliver these changes to the private rented sector. I think what we saw under the previous government, where you had these amendments to water down the bill being supported by at times, you had around 50 MPs supporting these amendments, and more than a third of them were landlords, and that's way higher than the average for Parliament and even the average for the Conservative Party. So clearly, landlords themselves were overrepresented in those trying to water down the legislation. And, I guess it would be impossible to prove people's motivations, but I think those stats slightly speak for themselves about what might have been happening there. And, I mean, when it comes to this government, you mentioned there that the biggest landlord in Parliament is a Labour MP. I think that case was obviously very disgraceful, but I did find it interesting that Jaz Athwal, in his statement, had the gall slightly to call himself a renters champion, but the fact that he felt the need to do that in some ways shows that I think in terms of the internal politics of the Labour Party, it doesn't do you any favours to be seen as a landlord looking after themselves. So maybe have a bit more hope this time around that will be less of an issue. That said, we will continue to I think be vigilant in that regard, and I think any attempts to water down the bill hopefully we'll be able to fight off.
Is there anything you think the bill is missing, or any area where you think it doesn't go far enough?
Sure. So I think, the main issue is on affordability, basically. And so this bill, I think, is quite clear that it's just about tackling security of tenure for renters and quality, which are two massive issues. But it doesn't have that much to say about affordability of renting. Our view is that actually affordability isn't just about affordability, it undermines security as well. So for many people, if you get half of renters have no savings. And so if you get a big rent increase, for a lot of people, that if that's unaffordable, that's the same as getting a no-fault eviction. And when you look at the people being made homeless as a result of being at the end of a private rented sector tenancy, in a lot of cases it's no-fault evictions, but in a lot of cases it's a rent increase that they just simply cannot pay, and so they end up going to their local authority and reporting that they're at risk of homelessness. One of the things that we've called for is a cap on in-tenancy rent increases at the lowest of inflation or wage growth. I think that having some way of capping in-tenancy rent increases below the market would be a very important step in keeping people in their homes for longer. Now, I think we're quite clear that that's not going to solve our housing affordability problems. It's not a silver bullet, but we think that it would still nevertheless be an important measure. And longer term, the government are talking about house building as being key to driving improvements to affordability, not just in terms of renting, but also in terms of the cost of buying a home, and in terms of reducing homelessness, in terms of building more social housing, which is definitely part of the solution here. I suppose one of the problems maybe for the government is two sort of issues to maybe outline for them. The first being, are they building enough social housing vis-a-vis? Is it the right type of housing vis-a-vis, luxury flats? That's one thing to look at. And also in terms of the time that this is going to take to ramp up house building, and then you have a lag effect. If they are not seen to be delivering improved affordability and a better deal for renters, which includes a more affordable housing, then they're going to have big problems politically, because renters are very much the base of that put this government where they are now. And I think